The freezing winds of Stalingrad howled through the shattered streets, carrying the cries of a city on the brink of total destruction. German tanks rolled through the rubble. Soviet soldiers fought with their bed. Every building became a fortress. Every street became a graveyard. The world watched in horror as two massive armies clashed in what would become the bloodiest battle in human history. But here is something your history books never told you. Deep within the Soviet ranks, hidden from the eyes of the enemy, a brilliant and secretive team was waging a completely different kind of war. They did not carry rifles. They did not fire cannons. Their weapons were pencils, papers, and their extraordinary minds. They were fighting a silent battle of wits against the most guarded communications of the Nazi war machine. And what they discovered in those desperate freezing nights did not just turn the tide of Stalingrad. It redefined the very concept of strategic warfare. It saved countless lives, and it changed the course of the entire Second World War. This is the story that has remained hidden for decades. This is the story of the secret Soviet codebreakers. Before we dive into this incredible journey through history, do me a small favor. If you love stories about hidden heroes and secret wars, hit that subscribe button right now. Click the bell icon so you never miss another untold story from the shadows of history. And if you find this video fascinating, smash that like button. It helps more history lovers find these forgotten tales. Now, let us travel back in time to one of the darkest chapters of human history. The year was 1941. Adolf Hitler stood at the height of his power. His armies had swept across Europe like a terrible storm. France had fallen. Poland had been crushed. The swastika flew over a dozen conquered nations. And then Hitler made a decision that would eventually destroy him. He turned his eyes toward the Soviet Union. On June 22, 1941, over 3 million German soldiers crossed into Soviet territory. It was the largest military invasion in human history. They called it Operation Barbarossa. Hitler believed the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. He called the Red Army a house of cards that would crumble at the first kick. At first, it seemed he was right. The German army advanced with terrifying speed. They captured millions of Soviet soldiers. They surrounded Leningrad. They pushed toward Moscow. Stalin and his generals were caught completely off guard. The Soviet military was in chaos. Defeat seemed inevitable. But Hitler wanted more than just Moscow. He wanted to crush the Soviet Union completely. And to do that, he needed oil. The massive German war machine consumed enormous amounts of fuel. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, they all needed oil to keep moving. And the richest oil fields in all of Europe lay in the Caucasus region, deep in southern Soviet territory. To reach those oil fields, the Germans first needed to capture one city, a city that sat on the banks of the Volga River, a city that bore the name of the Soviet leader himself, Stalingrad. In the summer of 1942, Hitler ordered his Sixth Army, one of the most powerful military forces ever assembled, to capture Stalingrad at any cost. The commander of this mighty army was General Friedrich Paulus, a careful and methodical officer who had helped plan the invasion of the Soviet Union. Under his command were over 300,000 soldiers, supported by tanks, artillery, and the fearsome Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. The German advance towards Stalingrad began in July 1942. At first, everything went according to plan. Soviet resistance crumbled before the German onslaught. By August, German forces had reached the outskirts of the city. On August 23rd, the Luftwaffe launched a massive bombing raid on Stalingrad. Over 1,000 aircraft dropped bombs on the city, turning it into a burning wasteland. Tens of thousands of civilians died in a single day. The city was transformed into a hellscape of fire and rubble. But then something unexpected happened. The Soviet soldiers did not retreat. Instead, they dug in among the ruins and began to fight with a ferocity that shocked the Germans. Stalin had issued a famous order: not one step back. Every soldier was expected to fight to the death. Retreat meant execution. And so the soldiers of the Red Army fought with desperate courage, knowing that their only choices were victory or death. What followed was the most brutal urban combat in military history. The fighting was measured not in kilometers, but in meters, sometimes in individual rooms and staircases. Germans and Soviets fought hand-to-hand among the shattered buildings. Snipers lurked in every window. Machine gun nests covered every street. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier arriving in Stalingrad was less than 24 hours, yet still they fought. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, the war. Both sides lived like animals in the ruins, fighting and dying in the endless rubble. The battle consumed entire divisions. Fresh troops arrived only to be ground up in the merciless fighting. Weeks turned into months, and still the city would not fall. But while this terrible carnage was happening in the streets of Stalingrad, another war was being fought in absolute secrecy. This was a war of the mind, a battle of intelligence and deception, and it would prove just as important as the fighting on the ground. You see, the Germans were extremely confident in their communications. They used a system of encryption that they believed was completely unbreakable. Every order, every troop movement, every supply request was encoded before being transmitted by radio. The Germans were certain that even if the Soviets intercepted these messages, they would never be able to read them. They were wrong. Deep within Soviet territory, far from the front lines, teams of brilliant mathematicians, linguists, and puzzle solvers worked around the clock in absolute secrecy. These were the Soviet Codebreakers, and their mission was to pierce the veil of German communications. They worked in cramped, cold rooms, surrounded by stacks of intercepted messages. They had no computers, no modern technology. They had only their minds, their training, and their desperate determination to save their country. The Soviet Signals Intelligence Organization was known by several names throughout the war. Different departments handled different aspects of the work. Some focused on intercepting German radio transmissions, others worked on breaking the codes. Still others analyzed the decrypted messages and extracted useful intelligence. Together they formed a vast but hidden network that listened to everything the Germans said. Breaking German codes was incredibly difficult. The encryption systems used by the German military were sophisticated and complex. Each message had to be painstakingly analyzed, looking for patterns, for repeated phrases, for any weakness that could be exploited. It was tedious, exhausting work that required both mathematical genius and endless patience. But the Soviet codebreakers had several advantages. First, they were highly motivated. This was not an academic exercise. Every code they broke, every message they decrypted, could save the lives of their countrymen. The Germans were not just an enemy army. They were an existential threat. If the Soviet Union fell, there would be no mercy for its people. This knowledge drove the codebreakers to work harder and longer than seemed humanly possible. Second, the Soviets had been preparing for this war for years. Even before the German invasion, Soviet intelligence had been studying German communications methods. They had recruited agents in Germany who provided valuable information about encryption procedures. They had captured German codebooks and equipment during the early fighting. All of this gave them a foundation on which to build their code-breaking efforts. Third, the Germans made mistakes. In the chaos of war, proper security procedures were sometimes ignored. Officers would reuse code settings. Operators would send the same message in both encrypted and unencrypted form. Small errors like these could give codebreakers the clues they needed to unlock an entire encryption system. As the battle for Stalingrad raged on, the Soviet codebreakers achieved a series of remarkable breakthroughs. They began to read significant portions of German military communications. They learned about troop movements, supply shortages, and command decisions often before the German units themselves received their orders. This intelligence flowed upward through the Soviet command structure, reaching the generals who were planning the defense of Stalingrad. One of the most important pieces of intelligence concerned the vulnerability of the German flanks at Stalingrad. The German Sixth Army was concentrated in the city itself, fighting street by street to capture every block. But the flanks of this massive force were protected not by German troops, but by soldiers from Germany's allies, primarily Romania and Italy. These allied forces were less well-equipped, less well-trained, and less motivated than the German soldiers. They held long stretches of the front line north and south of Stalingrad. The Soviet codebreakers discovered that the Germans knew about this weakness, but did not have enough troops to reinforce their allies. Intercepted messages revealed German concerns about the stretched flanks, requests for reinforcements that were denied, and growing anxiety among German commanders. This intelligence was gold. While the world focused on the brutal fighting in the city, Soviet generals began planning something far more ambitious than mere defense. They were planning a massive counteroffensive that would not just push back the Germans, but completely surround and destroy an entire German army. The plan was codenamed Operation Uranus. Two massive Soviet forces would attack the weak Romanian and Italian units protecting the German flanks. One force would strike from the north, the other from the south. If successful, the two forces would meet behind Stalingrad, completely encircling the German Sixth Army. It was an incredibly risky plan. If the attacks failed, the Soviets would have wasted precious reserves that were desperately needed elsewhere. But if it succeeded, it would be a catastrophe for Germany. Soviet planning for Operation Uranus was conducted in absolute secrecy. The movements of over 1 million soldiers, thousands of tanks, and mountains of supplies had to be concealed from German intelligence. Troops moved only at night. Radio silence was strictly enforced. Elaborate deception operations were conducted to convince the Germans that any Soviet offensive would come elsewhere. The intelligence provided by the Codebreakers was essential to this planning. Soviet commanders knew exactly where the German and Allied units were positioned. They knew which units were under strength. They knew about German supply problems and fuel shortages. They knew that the Luftwaffe was stretched thin and would struggle to support the ground forces. This knowledge allowed them to identify the perfect points of attack. On November 19, 1942, Operation Uranus began. In the frozen darkness before dawn, thousands of Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The bombardment was so intense that survivors described it as the end of the world. Then, the Soviet tanks rolled forward. The Romanian forces on the northern flank were hit first. Within hours, their lines had completely collapsed. Thousands of soldiers surrendered. Others fled in panic. The Soviet tanks pushed forward through the gap, racing toward the city of Kalach, far behind Stalingrad. The next day, the southern attack began. The Romanian and Italian forces there met the same fate. The Germans were caught completely by surprise. They had expected the Soviets to continue grinding away in the city, not to launch a massive offensive across frozen steppes. German commanders desperately tried to organize a defense, but it was too late. The Soviet pincers were closing too quickly. On November 23, just 4 days after the offensive began, the northern and southern Soviet forces met near Kalach. The encirclement was complete. The entire German Sixth Army, over 300,000 soldiers, was trapped in Stalingrad. It was the first time in history that an entire German army had been surrounded. The German high command was stunned. Hitler refused to believe the reports at first. When he finally accepted reality, he made a fateful decision. He ordered the Sixth Army to hold its positions and wait for rescue. He promised that the Luftwaffe would supply the trapped army by air, and that a relief force would break through to save them. Both promises proved impossible to keep. The Luftwaffe tried desperately to fly supplies into Stalingrad, but Soviet fighters and anti-aircraft guns shot down plane after plane. The amount of supplies that reached the trapped army was only a fraction of what they needed to survive. The soldiers began to starve. The wounded died for lack of medicine. Frostbite claimed thousands of victims as the brutal Russian winter set in. Meanwhile, the Germans organized a relief force under General Erich von Manstein, one of their most talented commanders. Operation Winter Storm, as it was called, began on December 12. German tanks pushed toward Stalingrad, fighting through fierce Soviet resistance. At one point, they came within 48 kilometers of the trapped army, but the Soviets had anticipated this rescue attempt. Intelligence from the Codebreakers had revealed German plans for the relief operation. Soviet commanders had positioned their reserves to block exactly this kind of breakthrough. Fresh Soviet divisions counterattacked, stopping the German advance and then pushing it back. Operation Winter Storm had failed. The Sixth Army was doomed. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, conditions became apocalyptic. The soldiers ate their horses, then rats, then leather, and typhus and dysentery swept through the ranks. Wounded men froze to death in aid stations. The dead could not be buried because the ground was frozen solid. Bodies piled up in the streets and cellars. Yet Hitler still refused to allow a surrender. He promoted Friedrich Paulus to the rank of Field Marshal, knowing that no German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the death or take his own life. On January 31, 1943, he surrendered to Soviet forces. It was the most significant German defeat of the war. Of the 300,000 German soldiers who had been trapped at Stalingrad, over 150,000 had died during the siege. Another 90,000 were taken prisoner. Of these prisoners, fewer than 5,000 would ever return home. Most died in Soviet labor camps from disease, starvation, and exhaustion. The victory at Stalingrad was a turning point not just for the Eastern Front, but for the entire Second World War. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It proved that the Wehrmacht could be defeated. It gave hope to occupied nations across Europe. and it marked the beginning of the long Soviet advance that would eventually end in the ruins of Berlin. The contribution of the Soviet codebreakers to this victory was immense but largely invisible. They did not fire a single shot. They did not throw a single grenade. But their work provided the intelligence that made Operation Uranus possible. They revealed the weakness of the German flanks. They uncovered the limitations of German supplies and reinforcements. They helped Soviet commanders understand exactly where and when to strike. After the war, the story of the Soviet codebreakers remained hidden for decades. The Soviet government kept its intelligence successes classified, partly to protect ongoing operations, and partly to preserve the myth that victory came purely from the courage of Soviet soldiers. The codebreakers themselves were forbidden from discussing their work. Many went to their graves without ever receiving public recognition for their contributions. Only in recent years, as archives have slowly opened and historians have gained access to classified documents, has the full story begun to emerge. We now know that Soviet signals intelligence was far more sophisticated and successful than previously believed. We know that the codebreakers played a crucial role not just at Stalingrad, but in many other battles throughout the war. The names of most individual codebreakers remain unknown. They worked in anonymity during the war, and they have largely remained anonymous since. There are no statues dedicated to them, no holidays commemorate their work. Yet their contribution to victory was as real and as important as that of any general or soldier. Their story reminds us that war is not just about brute force, it is also about intelligence. In both senses of the word, the ability to gather information about the enemy, to understand their plans and intentions, to anticipate their actions before they take them, this can be just as decisive as bullets and bombs. The Soviet codebreakers understood this truth, and they dedicated their lives to the silent war of minds. The legacy of Stalingrad extends far beyond the military sphere. It demonstrated the importance of signals intelligence and codebreaking in modern warfare. After the war, every major nation invested heavily in electronic intelligence gathering and cryptography. The code-breaking techniques developed during the Second World War laid the foundation for the computer revolution that would transform our world. Many of the mathematicians and engineers who worked on wartime codes went on to build the first computers and develop the technologies that shape our lives today. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Soviet codebreakers is the reminder that heroism takes many forms. The soldiers who fought and died in the ruins of Stalingrad were heroes, certainly. Their courage and sacrifice will never be forgotten, but the quiet men and women who worked in secret rooms, breaking codes and reading enemy messages, were heroes too. They saved countless lives with their minds. They changed the course of history with pencils and paper. The next time you read about the great battles of the Second World War, remember the hidden war that was fought alongside them. Remember the codebreakers who worked in the shadows. Remember that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with wisdom. And remember that even today, in conflicts around the world, there are men and women fighting secret battles that we will never see, using skills we can barely imagine to protect their countries and their people. The wind no longer howls through the streets of Stalingrad. The city has been rebuilt and renamed. Today it is called Volgograd, and it stands as a memorial to the millions who died there. Monuments and museums tell the story of the battle. But for decades, one part of that story remained untold, the story of the secret Soviet codebreakers who turned the tide of Stalingrad. Now you know their story. Now you can honor their memory. And now you understand that in the darkest hours of the Second World War, when the fate of nations hung in the balance, victory came not just from courage and sacrifice, but from the quiet genius of a few remarkable minds. If this story amazed you, imagine how many more untold tales are waiting to be discovered. Hit that subscribe button and join our community of history lovers. Every day we bring you stories that your textbooks forgot to mention. Leave a comment below telling me what hidden history you want me to explore next. Was it the spies? The secret weapons? The forgotten battles? Let me know. And if you want to dive deeper into the mysteries of World War II, click the video appearing on your screen right now. Trust me, you do not want to miss it. Until next time, keep exploring the shadows of history.